They locked the door while I was still standing on the porch, holding the casserole dish I had baked with my own hands, steam still fogging the lid as the drizzle turned heavier and slid into sheets across my coat. That sound, the dry, final click of a bolt pushed into place from the inside, has stayed with me more than any of the words they would later try to use to explain it, because words can be twisted and forgotten. But that sound, that metallic certainty, was truth. I remember I knocked once, not hard, just the way you might if you forgot your gloves and wanted your daughter to let you back in quickly before the rain soaked you through. But there was no answer. Only shadows shifting behind curtains they thought I couldn't see through. I stood there on the steps of the house I had poured money into when foreclosure loomed. The house I painted the trim of one summer when they couldn't afford a handyman. The house where I had been the invisible laundress, cook, and babysitter for years. And as the water ran down the sides of the dish and cooled the cheese I had grated that morning, I realized that not only was I not being let in, I was no longer meant to be part of the inside at all. My name is Martha. I am 78 years old, and I live alone now in a modest one-bedroom apartment above a library storage annex, a place that smells faintly of paper and dust. A place I chose for myself after years of being treated as if I were a guest, overstaying my welcome in lives I had in fact made possible. But that night on the porch, when the lock turned against me, I was not yet free. I was a woman in the rain, clutching a casserole dish as if it were a passport, back into a country that had quietly revoked my citizenship. I could tell you that there had been warning signs, and perhaps there were. Though when you love people, you often train yourself not to notice the signs that point to exile. My daughter, Anne, had grown increasingly impatient with the way I folded laundry, as if efficiency were a higher virtue than tenderness. Her husband, Mark, flinched whenever I tried to share stories at the dinner table, always redirecting the conversation to school schedules or mortgage rates, matters that were supposed to define adulthood, as if my decades of living were an intrusion into their curated lives. They no longer asked me to sit at the head of the table on Sundays. They bought chairs with hard backs instead of cushions, because I was the only one who complained. They even rolled their eyes at the salt I sprinkled on green beans, saying the children should be raised with healthier tastes, as if taste were a moral crime. Small things, always small, until suddenly, the sum of small cruelties was a decision to shut a door in my face. I had come back from the pharmacy that day, carrying their prescriptions with mine, because Anne had asked if I wouldn't mind. I never minded. Mothers do not mind errands when errands are the only thing left that tether them to relevance. The rain had begun just as I reached the driveway, and I remember thinking the hydrangeas I had planted last year might bloom better for it. The kitchen window was glowing warmly, and I could see silhouettes moving. I smiled at the thought of stepping into that glow, at the idea that the smell of my casserole might be welcomed after a long day, that maybe tonight the children would eat without complaint, and I would feel, for an hour, less like a shadow in my own family's home. But as I put the key into the lock, it stopped. I tried again. It didn't fit. My hand trembled slightly, not from age, but from the dawning knowledge that something irreversible had already been done. That was when the door opened just a crack, enough for Anne's voice to slip out, low and hurried. "Mom, please, not now. We'll talk later. Just go back to the store or something." Then the door shut, the bolt sliding firmly, and I stood staring at wood I had once polished with lemon oil, as if staring would persuade it to dissolve into mercy. I don't know how long I stood there before the casserole grew heavy in my arms, but I remember the rain thickening until my shoes filled with water, and still I did not move, because moving would mean acknowledging that they had made a choice. At some point, Mrs. Hanley from next door shuffled out with her umbrella, giving me the kind of pitying glance people reserve for stray animals. She asked softly if I needed to wait inside her place, said she thought she heard something about boundaries from Anne the other day, and she trailed off with that embarrassed cough neighbors use when they know too much. That was the first time I realized it had not been a sudden moment of panic, but a planned exile, spoken of casually to others while I was left unaware. I thanked her, said I was fine, though I was not, and she walked away, leaving me with the wet comfort of her knowing eyes. There is humiliation in being shut out of a house you helped sustain, but there is a deeper humiliation in realizing that the story of your removal has already been told to others as a reasonable act, as a healthy choice. Later, Anne would say they needed privacy, that my presence was suffocating, that they were only doing what therapists advised. Mark would use words like space and boundaries and well-being, as if eviction could be dressed up in the language of mental health. But that night, what I heard was silence. No voices calling me back. No small hand pressing against the glass to wave me in. Only silence punctuated by the storm and the metallic certainty of the lock. I carried the dish back down the steps, water sloshing in my shoes, my knees aching from the weight, not of years, but of insult, and I walked until the glow of the house disappeared behind hedges trimmed too neatly to have been touched by my hands. I passed driveways that looked like glossy magazine spreads, where other families were gathering with laughter I could almost hear, and I wondered if behind those doors any other woman was discovering her invisibility too late to fight it. When I reached the main road, I set the casserole down on a bus stop bench, the steam finally gone, the rain making the cheese skin over like a wound left untended. I looked at it, absurd and heavy, and thought, there lies the last offering they will ever refuse to acknowledge. Then I kept walking. By the time I reached the hardware store that doubled as the locksmith's office, the rain had flattened my hair against my skull, and my coat clung to me like a second, heavier skin. The store smelled of metal and dust, and the young man behind the counter glanced up, surprised, maybe at my age, maybe at the fact that I was dripping on his welcome mat. I told him I needed a lock, not for a house, but for a storage unit, though what I wanted in truth was something harder to sell, a sense of possession over anything in my life. He nodded without fuss, as if women my age walked in every day with storms on their shoulders, and he asked questions that were practical, not pitying. I remember gripping the counter, thinking how strange it was to feel steadier here, among cold brass keys and indifferent shelves, than in the warm house where I had once been mother, nurse, and provider. He did not know me, did not owe me history or explanation, and yet I felt more visible in his neutral gaze than in the polished kitchen, where my own blood had turned me into an inconvenience. I tell you all this not because I enjoy reliving the pain of that night, but because it was the beginning of the truth. They shut me out, yes, but in doing so, they also unlocked something I had kept bolted deep inside for too long. The possibility that my life could still belong to me. I did not know it then. At that moment, I only knew the weight of rain, the heaviness of rejection, and the humiliation of standing where I no longer had permission to exist. But as I sit here now, in a quiet apartment above a library that does not care who I am as long as I return books on time, I can see that their lock was not the end. It was a beginning. And the sound that once haunted me, the sharp, final click of being shut out, has transformed into a different kind of sound in my memory. The click of a key turning forward. The first sound of freedom. The true blow did not come with the rain, or even with the sight of the locked door, but with the confirmation, later that week, that what I felt was not some misunderstanding, not an overreaction brought on by weather or fatigue, but a deliberate, calculated act of exclusion, signed and sealed not only by the bolt in the door, but by the paper trail they had already begun to assemble in my absence. After I left the porch that evening, soaked and holding nothing but the ache of my own foolish hope, I wandered with no clear destination until the drizzle turned into a downpour, and I found myself under the flickering neon light of the hardware store, where the smell of cut wood and metal shavings clung to the air. I had not intended to speak to anyone, yet words tumbled out of me like water through a crack in a roof, and the young locksmith, whose name I would later learn was Rico, simply listened without the usual glaze of polite dismissal people adopt when an old woman begins to speak too much. At first I spoke of locks, of needing one for a storage unit, and then of needing one for myself, for some place that was not provisional, not borrowed, not conditional on the moods of others. He nodded and pulled down boxes from the shelf, keys jangling in his hand like a sound more promising than any lullaby. But the true confirmation arrived the next morning, slipped under my apartment door in an envelope with my daughter's neat handwriting. I knew even before I opened it that the words inside would not be an apology, because apologies arrive in voices, trembling, hurried, sometimes clumsy, but never typed and folded so carefully they cut when you touch them. Inside was a letter that began not with love, but with justification. The kind of justification that has been rehearsed in couples' conversations behind closed doors for weeks, perhaps months, before the chosen target is allowed to hear it. They told me they had consulted professionals, that living together was detrimental to their family harmony, that boundaries were essential for the children's development, that my presence had created tension, that they had tried to address it indirectly, which was their way of saying they had rolled their eyes, shared glances above my head, and left me out of plans until I should have taken the hint. But I had not taken the hint, and so they had chosen to be clear. "Please understand," the letter said, "this is what's best for everyone." For everyone, meaning themselves. There was no mention of the nights I had stayed awake with fevers that were not mine. No mention of the checks I had written when jobs were lost. No mention of the fact that the very roof under which they claimed I was an intruder had once been saved by my savings. I read the letter through twice, then a third time, searching for any trace of tenderness, of regret, of recognition, and finding only the sterile language of self-protection. Even the closing line, "We love you, but we need distance," was a contradiction dressed as kindness, because love that locks you out in the rain is not love, but convenience seeking a softer name. I folded the letter and slid it back into its envelope. Then I did something that surprised even me. I laughed. Not the kind of laugh that releases joy, but the brittle, sharp laugh that cracks when something fragile breaks at last. For a moment, I saw myself as they must have seen me, a shadow hovering in their curated rooms, a reminder of age they did not want in their photographs, a story they wished to rewrite without the weight of my presence. And though the sting of that realization cut deep, there was also a strange relief in it, because at least the truth was naked now. At least there was no longer a need to pretend that the distance between us was accidental. They had written it down, sealed it, delivered it, and in doing so, they had placed the burden of clarity in my hands. The act of betrayal was no longer something I could misinterpret. It was official, tangible, printed in ink. That was the true catalyst, the moment when betrayal shed its disguise and stood before me in plain words. That evening, I walked back to their street, not to confront, but to see with new eyes. The house glowed as it always had. Children's laughter floated faintly through the windows, and for a brief second, I almost convinced myself to knock and demand entry, to insist that the bonds of blood outweighed whatever justifications they had mustered. But then I saw through the window what I had not let myself notice before. The mantel, once cluttered with family photographs, now held only posed studio images of Anne's in-laws, of her children in coordinated outfits, of staged smiles where I was absent. My image had been erased not with scissors, but with neglect, replaced by curated frames that suggested I had never existed in their story. I stood on the sidewalk, rain dripping from the hood of my coat, and realized that even if they had opened the door, there was no longer a place for me inside. The act of betrayal was not the locked door. It was the long erasure that preceded it, the silent editing of memory until I became unnecessary. I walked away, each step heavier than the last, until I found myself at the small diner near the bus station, a place where the fluorescent lights were unflattering and the coffee weak, but where no one cared who sat alone. I ordered soup I could barely taste and pulled the letter from my pocket, smoothing it flat on the counter as if by pressing it down, I could also press down the ache in my chest. The waitress glanced at it and then at me, and though she said nothing, her eyes lingered with the kind of understanding that is wordless and therefore more merciful than any attempt at advice. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to sit in the role of someone cast out, not with dignity, not with the strength of choice, but with the sting of being unwanted. And in that diner, amid the smell of grease and the hum of a tired jukebox, I understood. I had been given my sentence, and it was exile. When I finally returned to my small apartment, dripping umbrella in hand, I placed the letter on the table and sat staring at it until the night blurred into morning. I thought of my mother, who had never owned a home, but who welcomed everyone into her kitchen as if it were a palace, and I wondered what she would think of her granddaughter's decision to close doors instead of open them. I thought of my late husband, who used to say that family is not measured by comfort, but by inconvenience, by the willingness to be present, even when it is not easy. I thought of the decades I had given, the sacrifices I had made quietly, never asking for gratitude. And I thought of how those decades had been repaid with a letter that reduced me to a problem, a burden, a disruption. And as I sat there, I realized that I could never again walk into their house without feeling the phantom of the lock turning against me. That knowledge was the true catalyst. It was the moment when I stopped hoping for return and began to see the necessity of departure. The betrayal was complete, and though it crushed me, it also freed me from the illusions I had clung to for too long. What followed after the letter was not some thunderclap of clarity or a single act of rebellion, but the slow suffocation of days that reminded me again and again of what it means to be diminished by inches until you no longer recognize the shape of your own life. At first, I thought perhaps time would soften the wound, that maybe Anne would call me, embarrassed, apologetic, ready to frame the incident as a misunderstanding. And I admit that I even rehearsed the kind of gracious acceptance I might offer if she did. Because mothers, even injured ones, dream of reconciliation. But the call never came, and instead of reconciliation, there came a quiet worsening, a gradual erasure of my presence from routines that had once given me purpose, until I understood that the lock on the door was not just a physical barrier, but the symbol of an ongoing exile that grew heavier with every silence that followed. I had spent so many years living in their house that even in my small, rented apartment, I felt like a visitor, pacing from one wall to the other, hearing the echoes of children's laughter that no longer sought me, catching myself setting an extra plate on my table before realizing that I now ate alone. The worst part was not the solitude itself, which I could have borne, but the way solitude was painted as necessity by people who once claimed to need me. It was as if the very currency of my usefulness had been devalued overnight, and I could no longer trade care for belonging. There were moments when the cruelty was subtle enough to masquerade as practicality. For weeks after the lockout, I continued to receive group emails from Anne about school events or family updates. But my name was no longer written in the salutations, and gradually the emails themselves stopped arriving altogether, as if someone had quietly removed me from the list. Neighbors who used to wave warmly now looked at me with that awkward pity that suggested they had been briefed on a story that cast me as an overbearing matriarch who had to be cut loose for the health of everyone else. Even my granddaughter, sweet Sophie, who once rushed into my arms after school, began to look at me with a kind of confused hesitation the few times I glimpsed her at a distance, as though someone had whispered that I was too fragile, too strange, perhaps even unsafe. The erosion of trust is not always a storm. Sometimes it is a dripping faucet, each drop wearing away at the stone until the stone yields. That was the first escalation, not the violence of confrontation, but the slow, deliberate quieting of my place in the world I had helped build. I began to notice how people spoke to me differently in shops, in the pharmacy, at the bank. It might have been my imagination, but it seemed that once you have been cast as irrelevant in your own family, the world at large senses it too, as if dismissal were contagious. Clerks looked past me to the younger customers. Bank tellers spoke in a tone that bordered on condescension, and more than once I was asked whether I needed help carrying bags that were lighter than burdens I had carried all my life. I realized that what had happened in Anne's house was not an isolated event, but part of a larger script the world keeps for women my age. You are needed until you are not, and once you are not, you become invisible, expected to step aside quietly without protest. The rain that night had washed more than the streets. It had washed away the illusion that my place was secure, and every day that followed was another lesson in how quickly security dissolves. The strangest part was how I kept returning, in my mind, to the sound of that lock turning. I heard it while I washed dishes in the small sink of my apartment. I heard it while I tried to read novels that could no longer hold my attention. I even heard it in the middle of the night when I woke sweating from dreams of being left behind at train stations, bus stops, airports. That sound became a rhythm in my chest, a reminder that belonging was conditional, that safety could be revoked without warning. And yet, perversely, I still longed to be called back, still imagined what it would feel like to hear Anne's voice on the phone, breaking, apologizing, asking me to return. But instead of a phone call, what I received was silence. And silence is its own form of cruelty, because it forces you to speak to yourself, until your voice grows hoarse with loneliness. I tried to fill the days with small rituals, the kind that give structure to hours that might otherwise collapse into grief. I went to the library and checked out cookbooks I no longer needed, because cooking for one feels like performance without audience. I baked bread and brought it to the church basement, where volunteers served the homeless, and while they thanked me politely, none of them knew that I was feeding them, partly to remind myself that I still had something to offer. I walked through the park in the mornings and watched other grandmothers with strollers, their laughter light, their arms full of infants who reached for them without hesitation, and I tried not to imagine the weight of Sophie's hand in mine. But the more I tried to replace what had been taken, the more I understood that the damage was not just absence, but the deliberate rewriting of my role, the insistence that I no longer belonged where I had once been central. And that understanding deepened the wound until even sunlight felt like accusation. One evening, weeks after the lockout, I passed by their house again, unable to resist the pull of habit, and I saw through the window a gathering around the dinner table. They were laughing, plates full, the children bickering playfully, Anne smiling in a way she rarely did when I was present, and it hit me with the force of something I had not allowed myself to consider. They were not only managing without me, they seemed lighter without me. I staggered back into the shadows, ashamed at my own spying, but the image remained lodged in me like a splinter. I had believed that I was essential, that my presence was woven into the fabric of their family, but perhaps I had been nothing more than a patch easily replaced. That realization did not kill me, but it reshaped me, made me smaller, quieter, more hesitant. It taught me to withhold, to retreat, to shrink before I could be pushed again. That was how the escalation worked. Not by slamming doors, but by convincing me to close my own slowly, one after another, until there was hardly any air left in the rooms of my heart. I think now of those days as the gray period, not because the skies were always cloudy, though they often were, but because I felt drained of color myself. I moved through the world like a woman coated in ash, trying not to draw notice, trying not to provoke further rejection. The people at the co-op where I eventually found part-time work saw only a quiet older woman at a desk. But inside, I was still standing in the rain, casserole cooling, waiting for a door to open that never would. And perhaps that was why, when the locksmith offered me an unexpected kindness, it struck me so deeply. It was not just the keys he handed me later, or the lock he recommended for my storage unit, but the way he looked at me as if I were not yet erased, as if the weight I carried was visible and valid. In the landscape of erasure, even one clear gaze can feel like salvation. The escalation, then, was not marked by shouts or confrontations, but by silence and erasure, by the daily confirmation that I was no longer expected, no longer considered, no longer necessary. It was the long unraveling of identity that made me begin to understand that if I did not seize something new, I would dissolve entirely into the margins they had written for me. I did not yet know how to seize it, or where to begin, but I knew that waiting for them to unlock the door was no longer an option. The key would have to come from elsewhere, perhaps from strangers, perhaps from within, but certainly not from the family who had decided that Rain was an acceptable place to leave me. The turning point did not arrive like a trumpet blast or a sudden revelation in the middle of the night. It came quietly, almost timidly, like a hand sliding under mine at a moment when I did not expect comfort. After weeks of drifting in that fog of invisibility, where every day seemed to echo the last, and my worth felt measured only by the silence that greeted me. There was an afternoon when I found myself back at the hardware store, not because I needed anything, but because I had grown used to the peculiar safety of that place. The shelves were lined with tools I did not know how to use. The air smelled of metal and sawdust, and the young locksmith, Rico, was busy behind the counter, cutting a key for a man who looked impatient to be anywhere else. I must have seemed aimless, but when his customer left, Rico looked at me with that same calm attentiveness he had offered the first time, and he asked simply, "You doing all right?" It was not the kind of question that expects the answer "fine" and then moves on. It was open, steady, and for a moment I felt as if I might cry, not from pain, but from the sheer relief of being asked. I said something vague, something about the rain making the days long, but he kept listening. And then, as if it were the most ordinary thing, he told me his grandmother had once lived with them until his parents decided she needed to move into a facility, and how he had been too young to argue, too timid to defend her, but that he had never forgiven himself for staying silent. "You remind me of her," he said. "Stubborn, but in the good way." It was not a grand speech, but it cracked something in me that had been sealed since that night on the porch, and I walked out of the store with more than the lock I had come to buy. I walked out with the first flicker of possibility that I was not condemned to invisibility, that someone outside the family narrative could still see me. That small exchange set into motion something I had not planned. The following morning, Rico slipped a flyer across the counter when I stopped in again, this time just to browse the shelves. It was an announcement for a part-time position at a local senior housing co-op, a front desk role that involved answering phones, greeting visitors, and keeping records. "You'd be good at it," he said. I almost laughed at the absurdity, because I had not worked in years, not since before Anne's children were born, when I had given up shifts at the clinic to help with the household, believing that contribution at home was equal to contribution outside. Yet something in the way he said it, not as a pitying suggestion, not as busy work to fill the time, but as a genuine belief that I could manage it, made me fold the flyer and slip it into my bag. That night in my apartment, I spread it on the table beside the unopened envelopes of bills and stared at the words, "Seeking reliable, organized individual." Reliable, organized. Two words that had once described me before I became burdensome and too much. I held the paper like a relic of a past self and wondered if it might also be an invitation to a new one. The next day, after pacing my small apartment for an hour, I put on the best blouse I still owned, navy with a collar that had not frayed, and I walked to the co-op. The building was unremarkable, brick and beige, but inside it smelled faintly of coffee and furniture polish, and the woman at the desk, who introduced herself as Joyce, looked me over with the sharp eyes of someone who does not waste time on unnecessary softness. She asked if I had experience, and I told her the truth, that I had raised children, kept households running, balanced budgets when there was nothing to balance, and that I had not worked formally in many years, but I had worked every single day of my life. She raised an eyebrow and said, "That'll do." And just like that, I was offered a trial week. I walked home that afternoon with my knees aching from the distance, but my heart beating with something I had not felt in months, the rhythm of purpose. It was not yet triumph, but it was movement, and movement is the first step away from despair. Starting at the co-op was humbling in ways I had not anticipated. The computer system seemed designed to humiliate anyone born before the internet, and my fingers shook on the keyboard, producing mistakes that would have embarrassed me if Joyce had not been brisk rather than cruel. She corrected me without indulgence, as if she expected me to learn, not as if she assumed I was incapable, and that difference was everything. By the end of the week, I was not fluent in the system, but I could manage, and I discovered that my real strength was not in the typing, but in the way I greeted people, in the way I remembered names and stories, in the way the residents, many of them my age or older, looked at me with recognition rather than dismissal. They saw in me not an intruder, but one of them, and the front desk became not just a counter, but a threshold where I could be both useful and visible. When Joyce told me at the end of the week that I was hired if I wanted the hours, I felt the air shift around me. It was the first time in years that someone had placed the decision in my hands, not taken it from me. The change was not dramatic, not a miracle cure for the ache of betrayal, but it was a shift nonetheless. With each small paycheck I earned, I felt a quiet pride in folding bills into my wallet that belonged entirely to me, not to a joint account, not to a family budget where my contributions disappeared into everyone else's needs. The first thing I bought with that money was a second-hand coat from a thrift shop, navy wool with deep pockets, a coat that fit me in a way that felt almost ceremonial. I wore it home as the evening wind rose, and for the first time since the lock had turned against me, I walked with my head higher, the fabric heavy and dignified on my shoulders, as if I had stitched back a piece of myself. Later that week, when I hung it by the door of my apartment, I touched the collar and whispered, "Mine." It was a word that had grown unfamiliar on my tongue, but one I intended to relearn. It was not only the job that changed me, but the slow realization that my days no longer revolved around waiting for someone else's call. I woke early, not because children needed breakfast, or because Anne wanted errands done, but because I had a shift to keep, and the rhythm of that responsibility gave structure to my mornings. I began to notice small details again. The way the light spilled through my apartment window at 8, the smell of the bakery near the bus stop, the sound of pigeons quarreling on the roof. These things had always been there, but I had not been there for them. I had been too consumed by proving my worth to people unwilling to see it. Now, free of that performance, I found myself present in ways I had forgotten were possible. The shift was not only external, from house to co-op, from family to independence. It was internal, from invisibility to recognition, from despair to cautious dignity. Of course, the past did not vanish. I still carried the image of that locked door in my chest, and some nights I woke with the taste of rain on my tongue. But I also carried new images. The smile of a resident who thanked me for remembering her son's name, the firm nod of Joyce when I completed a task without correction, the weight of my new coat warming me against the wind. These were not replacements for the love I had lost, but they were foundations for a life that no longer depended on permission from those who had withdrawn it. The shift was not a declaration of war, nor was it forgiveness. It was a recalibration of self, a quiet refusal to accept the role of discarded mother, a decision to step into a room of my own making, even if it was only a small desk in a beige building. Looking back, I see that this midpoint was not the end of pain, but the beginning of agency. I had stopped waiting for the phone to ring, stopped circling their street like a ghost, stopped defining myself by the door that would not open. Instead, I began to look for other doors, some literal, some metaphorical, and each time I found one, I tested it with my own key. Some opened, Some did not. But the important thing was that I was the one turning the lock. Peace, once it begins to take root, is fragile, like a plant pushing through cracked pavement, and it does not take much for old storms to return and bend it sideways. Just when I thought I had found a rhythm in the new life, the coat on its hook, the shifts at the co-op, the quiet mornings with coffee and crossword puzzles, the past began knocking again, not softly, but with the same insistence as rain against a window you cannot close. It started innocuously, with a letter slipped into my mailbox written in handwriting I recognized immediately, because it belonged to the only one of them who had ever really seen me. My grandson, Daniel's boy, Kieran. The envelope was plain, the paper lined, the ink uneven as though written in a hurry. But the words on it were enough to melt something in me I had sworn I would keep frozen. "Grandma," it read, "where are you? They said you left without a word, but I know that can't be the whole story. I miss you. Please let me know you're safe." The note was short, just a few lines, but it was the first time in months that someone from that family had spoken to me without framing my existence as a problem to be managed. I sat at my kitchen table staring at his words, the kettle whistling behind me, and for a long time I could not decide whether to feel grateful or wounded, because his concern was real. Yet it also reopened the cut, reminding me that the rest of them had chosen silence. I folded the letter carefully, slid it into the drawer beside my bed, and told myself I would not respond yet. Not because I did not want to, but because I needed to understand what responding would cost me. It might have remained just a single thread of connection, fragile and private, had it not been followed by something far more invasive. A week later, I returned home from the co-op to find a manila envelope propped against my door. Inside was a neatly printed article clipped from a regional newspaper back in Wilmington, the city I had left. The headline was lurid. "Missing Matriarch. Family Seeks Answers." Beneath it was a photograph of me taken years ago at some holiday gathering, holding a pie dish and smiling in that half-polite way you smile when the camera is always pointed at the grandchildren instead of you. The article quoted my son, Adam. Yes, Adam, who had turned his key in that lock without flinching, as saying they were deeply concerned about my well-being, that I had vanished suddenly, and that they feared something had happened to me. Lisa, my daughter-in-law, was quoted too, saying I was vulnerable and not the type to disappear on my own. I laughed out loud when I read that, a sharp bark of laughter that startled even me, because there it was again, the performance of care, the rewriting of reality, the suggestion that I was not a woman capable of choosing her own silence, but a fragile relic who must have stumbled into it by accident. Vulnerable, they called me, as if a woman who had held entire households on her back could be reduced to a trembling liability the moment she stopped serving them. For days after that article appeared, I lived with the peculiar sensation of being both hunted and erased. On one hand, they had painted me as missing, as lost, as someone in need of retrieval, and yet on the other hand, they continued to omit the truth, that they had locked me out deliberately, that they had written the letter that declared my presence unwelcome. What they wanted was not me, but the story of me, the image of a dutiful mother and grandmother who could be displayed publicly as part of their narrative while privately discarded. That contradiction gnawed at me until I found myself looking over my shoulder on the street. wondering if someone would recognize me from that outdated photograph, wondering if they would believe the article's version over my own truth. Invisibility had become not just private exile, but a public script, and it made me feel once again like the door had been shut. Only this time, the lock was not on wood and metal, but on the story itself. The pressure escalated further when one afternoon at the co-op, Joyce, the woman who had hired me and who had a sharp tongue but a fair heart, came to my desk holding a business card. A man in a suit had come by while I was on break, asking for me by name. He said he represented my son and daughter-in-law, that they were concerned about me, that they wanted to make sure I was in a safe environment. Joyce handed me the card without comment, her expression unreadable. But I could feel the heat rising in my chest as I read the embossed letters. Derek Sorensen, attorney at law. They had escalated from silence to performance to legal intimidation, trying to frame my independence as instability. I tucked the card into my coat pocket, but inside I seethed, because I understood then that they were not reaching out to reconnect, they were reaching out to control. To them, my absence was not a wound of the heart, but a threat to their authority, to their narrative, to whatever inheritance or property or reputation they believed was jeopardized by my refusal to play the role of grateful dependent. They did not want me back. They wanted the appearance of wanting me back, and they wanted the power to dictate the terms. The climax of that escalation came one gray Thursday afternoon when Lisa herself appeared in the cafe across from the co-op, where I sometimes stopped for tea. I spotted her immediately, not because she sought attention, but because she was so polished, so carefully assembled in her tailored coat and her shoes that had never met a puddle, that she looked like a foreign object against the cracked linoleum and steam-fogged windows. She stood near the pastry case pretending to read the chalkboard menu, but I knew she was waiting for me. And when at last I approached, she said my name in that low, careful voice she used when she wanted to appear reasonable. "Martha," she said, "can we talk?" I led her to a corner booth, not because I wanted to hear her excuses, but because I wanted her to squirm in a place that did not belong to her, a place where the hum of the refrigerator and the clatter of dishes could not be bent into her script. She began with pleasantries, then shifted quickly to the point. They were worried. They wanted to be sure I was managing. They had thought I was behind them that day at the airport. They had assumed I was fine. I let her speak until the words tangled themselves into contradictions, and then I leaned forward and said, 8 hours, Lisa. 8 hours I waited, and not once did you call. Not once did you check. Do you know what it is to sit alone until the world empties around you? Her face flushed, her manicure glinting as she fiddled with her coffee cup, and for once she did not have an easy rebuttal. She muttered something about panic, about the children, about stress. But I had already decided I would not give her the gift of absolution. When she left, she tried to soften the scene by slipping an envelope across the table. Inside was a photograph of my grandson as a little boy, sitting on my lap in the garden, both of us laughing, and tucked behind it a short note in his handwriting. I remember. I always remembered. My throat tightened as I read it, because that was the only acknowledgement I truly longed for, not from Adam, not from Lisa, but from the one child who had once seen me as more than utility. Still, even as that note warmed me, I understood that Lisa's delivery of it was not purely altruistic. It was bait, a way of keeping the thread taut between us so that control might still be tugged. I took the envelope home, placed the photograph in my drawer beside his earlier letter, and decided that I would guard those memories fiercely. But I would not let them be used as a leash. The days that followed were heavy with the sense that the past would not let me go quietly. Letters arrived, some signed, some anonymous, all echoing the same plea: return, reconcile, be reasonable. There were even whispers in the neighborhood that I had lost my mind, that perhaps my independence was a facade. Stories clearly seeded by someone who preferred me, framed as fragile rather than as deliberate. At the co-op, Joyce asked one evening over tea whether I was hiding or healing, and I told her the truth. Both. Because every time I felt myself stepping into freedom, another attempt from the past arrived to drag me back, to test whether my newfound agency was strong enough to withstand pressure. And that was the essence of the second escalation. It was not merely that they had cast me out. It was that they refused to allow me to remain gone on my own terms. They wanted me back, but only back into the role they had assigned. And when I refused that role, they sought to define me as unstable, vulnerable, unreasonable. Yet through the storm of letters, articles, and visits, something within me hardened into clarity. Each attempt to pull me back only confirmed that leaving had been necessary, and each insult wrapped in concern only reminded me that their love was a costume stitched for appearances. The escalation, painful as it was, became a mirror, and in it I saw not the frail woman they described, but a woman who had survived abandonment, humiliation, and erasure, and who still stood, who still chose, who still had the power to write her own ending. I did not yet know what action I would take, but I knew it was coming. Because once you have been locked out in the rain and you survive, you begin to realize that there is no lock in the world that can truly keep you from your own life again. The moment of decision, when it finally arrived, did not feel like lightning splitting the sky, but rather like a slow, deliberate turning of the soil after a long winter, a movement that was quiet on the surface, but irreversible underneath. For weeks I had endured their letters, their staged concerns, their clumsy attempts to present me as a lost woman in need of retrieval. But I had also been building something quietly, almost without knowing it. Each day at the co-op, I learned again the rhythm of responsibility. Each paycheck folded into my wallet reminded me that my independence was no longer an accident, but a structure. Each conversation with the residents who greeted me as an equal, rather than a burden, wove another thread into the fabric of a life that belonged solely to me. And then one evening, as I sat at my small kitchen table with the photograph of my grandson in front of me, the note from him tucked safely in its envelope, I realized that I could not continue to live in two worlds, half tethered to the house that had shut me out, and half reaching toward the life that was offering me shelter. I had to choose, and choice itself, after months of being acted upon, was a form of liberation. It began with money, because money, though inelegant, is one of the purest forms of power in a world that pretends to prize affection. I had always handled accounts in my household, stretching small sums into meals and bills, but after moving out, I had left my name entangled in a family account that was supposed to make shared expenses easier. In truth, it made me vulnerable, a lingering thread they could tug if they wished to reel me back under the guise of responsibility. So I walked into the bank one morning, the same bank where tellers had once spoken to me as if I were already diminished, and I sat down across from a clerk with a spine straighter than mine and said, with as much calm as I could gather, "Remove my name from any account connected to my daughter and her husband." Close whatever must be closed. Transfer what is mine into a separate account under my name only." The clerk hesitated, asked a few questions, but when she clicked her keyboard and finally handed me a printout that bore only my name, unaccompanied, I felt an exhale I had not taken in years. That simple sheet of paper was a declaration. I owed them nothing, not even a ledger line. But financial severance was not enough. There were still threads of obligation, small yet sharp, that bound me to their world. For years I had offered informal caregiving, rides to doctors, evenings babysitting, errands taken on without thought. And though I had long stopped being asked, those acts lived on as unspoken contracts, expectations that could be resurrected at will. I decided I had to end even the memory of such obligations. So I drafted a letter, formal in its tone, to Anne and Mark, stating clearly that I revoked any assumption of availability, that I would no longer provide unpaid labor, that if they needed assistance, they must look elsewhere. It was not spiteful, but firm, and when I mailed it at the corner box, the red flag clattering down, I felt as though I had finally slid shut a drawer that had been left open for decades. The click of the mailbox lid was my answer to the click of their lock. And then came the final act, the one that might seem small to anyone who has not lived through the peculiar cruelty of being erased in your own home, but which for me was monumental. Weeks after the lockout, I had remembered, almost absently, that I still possessed a spare key to their house, one they had forgotten I carried because I was always the one trusted to water plants or collect mail in their absence. I had not used it, partly out of pride, partly out of fear, but it remained at the bottom of a drawer in my apartment, cool and patient. On a Saturday morning, when the air was sharp with early autumn and the streets were unusually quiet, I slid that key into my coat pocket and walked back to the house I had once helped preserve. I did not intend to storm in or confront. Confrontation had lost its allure. What I wanted was one thing, and one thing only: a single photo album that contained pieces of my life before they had decided I was unnecessary. The house stood there, smug in its suburban tidiness, the hedges clipped, the curtains drawn. I knew they were out because both cars were missing from the driveway. My hand trembled slightly as I approached the door, but when I slipped the key into the lock, it turned with the same ease it always had, as though mocking the new locks they had installed on other doors. I stepped inside quietly, not to invade but to retrieve, and the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the roast that must have lingered from a previous dinner. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had, because I no longer belonged to this space, and I no longer wished to. I moved quickly through the living room, past the curated photographs where my face had been absent for months, into the hallway closet where I knew the albums were stacked. My fingers found the one I sought, its cover worn, the edges soft with years of turning pages. Inside were images of me as a younger woman, children clinging to my skirt, holidays crowded around tables, my husband alive and smiling. These were not for them to keep as evidence of their narrative. These were mine, my testimony that I had been central once, that I had been loved and needed and irreplaceable. I tucked the album under my arm and turned to leave. Before stepping out, I paused at the kitchen counter and pulled a piece of paper from my coat pocket, a note I had written the night before in steady script. "You changed the locks," it said, "so I changed the terms." I left it beneath a salt shaker, an object as ordinary as the words I had been dismissed for when I seasoned beans, and then I closed the door softly behind me, turning the key one final time. As I walked down the driveway with the album pressed to my chest, I felt a peculiar blend of grief and triumph. They would find the note. They would rage or dismiss or twist it into their story. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that I had entered and exited on my own terms, that I had taken what was mine without begging, without apology, and that the lock they had once used to exile me had become irrelevant in the face of my quiet defiance. That act, simple as it was the culmination of everything the rain had begun. I had severed ties, claimed independence, and walked back into the place of my humiliation, only to walk out carrying proof that I could not be erased. It was not a victory anyone else would applaud. There would be no headlines declaring my dignity restored, but I did not need applause. What I needed was the knowledge that the woman who had once stood shivering on a porch with a casserole had not been extinguished but transformed. And as I walked home, clutching that album, the autumn wind pulling at my coat, I knew with absolute clarity that they could no longer touch me, not with locks, not with letters, not with stories. The climax of my story was not their cruelty, but my refusal to remain defined by it. In the weeks that followed my quiet return to the house and my even quieter exit, life settled into a calm I had not known in years. Not the restless calm of waiting for the next summons, but the deep, steady calm of a woman who has finally stopped asking for permission to exist. I placed the photo album on the small bookshelf in my apartment, next to the cookbooks and the novels I meant to finish one day, and every so often I would run my hand along its spine, not to wallow in nostalgia, but to remind myself that I had reclaimed it, that I had chosen to keep it not as a relic of what was lost, but as evidence of what was lived. The note I had left behind, sharp as it was, did not provoke the flood of outrage or reconciliation I had once feared. Instead, there was silence. And in that silence I understood at last that their power over me had ended. They could speak about me however they wished. They could spin stories of absence or instability. But I had already written my own conclusion, and it did not require their signatures. At the co-op, my days grew fuller, the residents learning that they could come to me not only for directions or phone numbers, but for conversation, for small comforts, for the recognition that does not fade with age. I found myself laughing again, real laughter that reached my chest, sometimes at nothing more than a resident's stubborn insistence that the coffee machine had a personality, sometimes at my own mistakes on the computer that I could now correct without shame. On Sundays, I baked bread, the way I used to, but instead of setting it on a family table where my efforts would be critiqued or ignored, I carried loaves downstairs and sliced them for neighbors who received them with gratitude, unclouded by judgment. It was not the same as the family dinners I once orchestrated, but in some ways it was better, because it was chosen, it was shared freely, and it carried no debt. There were moments when I still felt the ache of absence, when I caught myself looking for Sophie's face in a crowd, or hearing Daniel's voice in the laughter of a passerby. And in those moments, the temptation to reach back toward them flickered like a candle struggling in the wind. But each time, I remembered the rain, the lock, the silence. And I remembered, too, the feeling of the key turning in my hand when I left their house with the album under my arm. That memory steadied me, not because it erased my love for them, but because it reminded me that love cannot survive without dignity, and dignity is not something you can beg for. It is something you claim. I chose not to chase them anymore. not to seek explanations or apologies that would never come. And in making that choice, I discovered a freedom that was larger than reconciliation. The freedom of living without needing their permission. Sometimes in the evenings, when I close the co-op office and walk home beneath the glow of the street lamps, I think of other women like me. Women who have stood on porches in the rain, or sat alone in airports, or waited by phones that never rang. Women who have been told in ways both subtle and cruel that their time of usefulness is over. I think of them, and I want to say, you are not gone. You are not erased. You are not too late. The world may try to lock you out, but somewhere there is a key waiting, and sometimes it is not the family you served who will hand it to you, but a stranger at a counter, a woman behind a desk, or your own trembling hand deciding at last to turn away from a closed door and walk toward an open one. That is the truth I carry now, the truth that steadies me when loneliness whispers at night. I end with this, not as advice, but as a message to whoever might find themselves standing in the rain as I once did. The locks they change are not the end of your story. They are the beginning of another. Take what is yours, leave what no longer belongs, and know that shelter can be built even after exile. I was locked out, yes, but the locksmith gave me more than keys. He gave me a reminder that openings exist where you least expect them. And now, when I sit in my small apartment above the library, the air smelling faintly of books and bread, I know that I am not locked out anymore. I am inside my own life, and that is enough.